The question is this bill be read a second time. I call the member for Baulkham Hills.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I rise to make a contribution on the Crimes Amendment Intoxication Bill 2014 and in doing so have to now amend the contribution that I had intended to make because of the previous speaker's high levels of hypocrisy. I am not going to stand here as a member of a coalition government to listen to the member for Heffron tell me that we're responding to a media campaign. The Labor Party in government wrote the book on media campaigns. They wrote the book on responding to media campaigns. They wrote the book so much that the coalition, the then opposition, used to call the former Premier Flip-Flop Bob because he would stand up and make a statement and then after the Daily Telegraph or Talkback Radio would make a submission or a contribution, all of a sudden Bob would look at the polling and he'd change his mind. And while the opposition is sitting there and while the member for Heffron is sitting there, I'll remind him of a few media campaigns that the opposition, while in government, made a response to. The knife laws. Remember them? Member for Heffron, remember the knife laws? We had knife laws in this state, and then because there were 2 or 3 knifings, Bob Carr came down here and made some amendments to legislation which even your own party were concerned about. He was responding to a Daily Telegraph media campaign. So don't stand up here. What about Keno? Remember Keno in 2000? The parliamentary secretary would remember that. The member for Heffron would remember that in about 2004, in accordance with the agreement the government had with Tabcorp, the then Labor government decided that they would introduce Keno into hotels. But there was a media outcry about it. The media were horrified that the then Labor Party, who were addicted to taxation on gambling, would expand Keno. So what did Bob do? Bob came down here and canned it. He canned a corporate agreement that the then Labor government was a party to because there was a response. There was a response in the media that needed to be addressed. Now, remember Windsor Road. I'm very grateful for the Labor Party responding to this one. The Shadow Minister might stand there and complain, but I remember the member for Hawkesbury can take credit for this, and as somebody who lives in the northwest, I'm very grateful that the Labor Party had such a thin skin that they had to respond to media campaigns because they had no intention of widening and upgrading Windsor Road. But luckily for the people of the northwest, the Daily Telegraph and Talkback Radio had a different opinion. And the Labor Party were responding to a media campaign. How about train guards? Remember that? We had a couple of assaults on trains and the Daily Telegraph and Talkback Radio said it's not safe to go on trains anymore. So the Labor Party introduced this wonderful system of having train guards go through carriages, costing a fortune, costing an absolute fortune, and not addressing the problem because the problem was a cultural one. But the Labor Party were responding to a media campaign. What about sentencing? What about sentencing? They've done it 1, 2, 3. We can categorise the times that the Labor Party have walked into this chamber whilst in government responding to a media campaign. So you have forfeited the right to stand up in this House and tell us that the Premier is responding to a media campaign. For 16 years, you guys wrote the book about it. You guys wrote the book about it. They used to call the Premier, the then Labor Premier, Flip-Flop Bob. You guys were, in the words of your former Labor Prime Minister, a shiver looking for a spine to travel up because you would only govern on polling. You would only govern on polling. Sussex Street would do some polling over on a Sunday night and they'd tell the then Cabinet that the community was concerned about something and lo and behold, Bob would come in here and announce grand plans to amend
You've been heard in silence. I warn members on the opposition benches that you already have warnings against you.
They come down here and amend legislation which was completely determined by what responses were made to the said polling run out of Sussex Street. And I see Labor members leaving the chamber because the truth hurts and they're in pain. They're in pain because the truth hurts. I cannot believe, of all the hypocritical speeches that have been made in this chamber, to have members of the Labor opposition to accuse us of making legislation in response to the way that the community concerns are raised. This is a genuine concern. This is a genuine concern in the community, and if we're guilty of anything, we're guilty of listening to our constituents. And don't tell me that the people opposite, don't tell me that members opposite have not been receiving the same sort of correspondence that I've been receiving. Don't you dare say that. And if you do want to say it, put it in Hansard. I want to see in Hansard you guys, opposition members, saying that the community is not asking for this legislation. I want you to stand up and say that nobody in your electorate is asking you for this sort of tough response to alcohol-related crime, because when you do put that on Hansard, what I can do is guarantee you this. I'm quite happy to grab the Liberal candidate for the electorates that is going to be nominating against you blokes, and I'll be happy to go
Member for Balmain, you moving a point of order?
I'll be happy to go door knocking with that Hansard. I'll be happy to tell the people in your electorate that Labor Party members are opposed to this tough legislation. And for the Shadow Attorney General to put the cherry on top, for the Shadow Attorney General, the Shadow Minister for Justice, the member for Heffron, for him to stand up and say to us that this legislation is in breach of an international treaty is absolutely laughable. Absolutely laughable. So those people that are writing those international treaties, the people of the competence of guys like Kevin Rudd, I know he might be a hero to you, mate, but the people of Australia have made their judgment on Kevin Rudd. But people like the member for Heffron to come up and stand up in this chamber and say, oh, we're not going to sign this legislation because it's in breach of an international treaty. Well, mate, let's go through the international treaties and work out how much legislation you introduced that was in breach of international treaties, mate, because it would be a very long debate. It would be a very long debate to stand up here and say to the Labor Party, let's go through the legislation that is in breach of international treaties. And for all of them, they stand up here, I'm surprised they haven't used this as an opportunity to completely cane people like Scott Morrison and the like. And that's the sort of thing that the Labor Party would have a go at. They're so committed to these international treaties, but you know their policies have been just as repugnant to these international treaties that ours have ever been. So please, guys, you have forfeited the right to stand up here and get on the moral high ground because you haven't. This is not a response to a media campaign. This is not a response to talkback radio. This is not a response to any of the type of legislation that you guys have introduced. We are listening to our electorate. We are listening to our constituents. And what I want the member for Heffron to do is, instead of standing up and criticising the Premier for listening to the people of New South Wales, instead of standing up and saying to the Premier, thank you for introducing tough legislation that we didn't have the guts to introduce, instead of doing that, why don't you ring up Thomas Kelly's father and say to him, listen, mate, I understand that your son was killed by a road drunk, but, mate, we're not going to respond to this. We're not going to support the type of legislation that will put Kieran Loveridge into jail because it's in breach of an international treaty. Oh, mate, no wonder you blokes have got no seats in Western Sydney, because you have got absolutely no understanding of the mentality of the people, the good people of New South Wales. You guys wouldn't understand how people of Sydney are fearful of the type of drunks that are carrying on across Sydney at the moment. This is the type of legislation. This is the type of legislation that the people of New South Wales are crying out for. This is the type of legislation that they are crying out for. I spent my summer in my electorate office listening to the concerns and fears of families, who are just too scared to allow their 18-year-old children to go out into the city. Is that the type of community that you want, member for Heffron? Is that the sort of community you want? You want the sort of community where families are saying to their kids, please don't go out tonight. I am too scared of the type of danger that you might face, and the government doesn't care about it because they're not going to introduce any legislation, they're not going to introduce any regulations that are going to make our community safe. That's not the community that I want to live in, mate. That is not the community I want to live in. Mr. Speaker, I seek an extension.
Member for Baulkham Hills seeks an extension. The favour say aye. Aye. Against say no. Member for Baulkham Hills, you have an extension.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Speaker. I'm just speechless. I've seen some hypocrisy in the 25 years that I've been in Parliament, been involved in politics, Mr. Speaker. I have seen some hypocrisy. I've seen Labor leaders stand up and tell us that we've had a recession that we had to have. I've seen Labor leaders stand up and say to us, I've seen Labor leaders stand up to us and say, listen, you know, you're going to get a Sydney Metro, and then the next Labor leader says, I'm sorry about the $500 million that we've wasted. I've seen Labor leaders, thank you to my colleague reminding me, I've seen Labor leaders stand up and say to us, listen, no child will have to live in poverty. I've seen, but you know, I have seen some Labor leaders stand up. I have seen Labor leaders stand up, Mr. Acting Speaker, and say make truthful statements. I have. I saw Paul Keating's letter to John Robinson. If ever truth was said by a Labor leader, it was that letter. I think that letter should be compulsory reading for everybody that is supporting the current opposition, because the current opposition are in dire straits. If their stocks have lowered so much that they've got to have the member for Blacktown as their leader, and if their stocks have lowered to such an extent that they are not going to stand up for decent, fair-minded Australian families that are fearful of having their children go out at night because of the fear of assault and intoxication, well then they are destined and condemned to opposition forever. I mean, Mr. Acting Speaker, I'm disgusted at the courts have repeatedly used drunkenness or illicit drugs as a mitigating circumstances. And therein lies the fundamental difference between me and the member for Heffron. Because the member for Heffron wants to stand up and tell everybody that no, doesn't really matter how bad a judge's decision is, doesn't matter how bad and out of touch a magistrate might be, we've got to give them the right to make a decision based on individual circumstances. Mr. Acting Speaker, I'm sorry, that's not the type of legal system I want to live in. Yes, we believe in the separation of powers, but Mr. Acting Speaker, there's a more powerful thing at stake here. There is a much more powerful thing at stake here than just the separation of powers, and that's democracy, Mr. Acting Speaker. That's democracy. Because we live in a society when everybody has a right to have their say. And I can tell you, Mr. Acting Speaker, as I read this legislation and I hear the tripe coming out of opposition, the hypocrisy that's coming out of opposition, I can say that I'm comfortable to go to my electorate next March and say to them, I voted for this legislation. The opposition don't want to do it because they want to protect their left-wing mates on the bench. Guys that have got absolutely
they would get to it.
You guys can laugh. You guys can laugh because
order.
You guys can laugh, mate.
Baulkham Hills has to call.
You guys might laugh, but I can tell you, when I go into Kira and I go into Cessnock and I say that your local Labor member voted against the legislation that is going to put people in jail for beating up and killing kids and using alcohol as a mitigating circumstances, fair-minded and decent people will reject you. Fair-minded and decent people will reject you. And the type of people that would vote for
Can I remind you again that you're already on a warning?
And Mr. Speaker, the type of people that would vote for a Member of Parliament that would vote against this legislation are the type of people that I don't want voting for me. I wouldn't want anybody that's going to criticise me for this legislation. I'm pretty confident that there wouldn't be anybody in my electorate that would criticise me for having this legislation. But if you guys want to produce, if you guys want to be on the record opposing it, go right ahead. Go right ahead. Because if I know the people of Cessnock, I know that they are good, decent people. They've got terrible taste in the local members, but they are good, honest people. And they would, like the people of Baulkham Hills, like the people being represented around this chamber, see that this legislation is essential. see that this legislation is the only way we're going to reduce the scourge of alcohol from killing our kids. Mr. Acting Speaker, I've worked in the hospitality industry and I left 7 years ago, never heard of the term pre-fueling. In the 10 years I worked there, I'd never heard the term pre-fueling. This legislation is essential because it's not only providing the confidence in our community that government is listening to them, it's essential because it's telling the bench we're not going to put up with it. I commend the bill to the House.